In A-level economics, we talk a lot about the macroeconomic goals, the targets that the government has to try and hit to mean that the economy is doing well. There are a number of them, but we look at four major goals. They are mostly interested in sustainable economic growth, so that's growth we can keep going year after year, not just happen once and then it's gone. They're interested in low, stable inflation. And it being stable is just as important as it being low. If it's bouncing around, that makes companies worried and they don't want to invest and things like that. They want low unemployment. We sometimes talk about full employment, but we don't actually mean everybody in the economy employed. So we want unemployment to be low, and we want the current account of the balance of payments to be balanced, or at least roughly balanced. So probably that means we've got exports roughly equal to imports. Together, they're the four major macroeconomic performance goals that the government has. And so if you're looking at an exam question and you see performance, think about those four things, and you can also talk about some of the subsidiary goals as well. Things like balancing the government budget, not damaging the environment too much, thinking about living standards, those things come in as well. But these are the four main ones. We're going to have a short video on each of those four, starting off now with sustainable economic growth. So what is economic growth? Well, it's the increase in the productive capacity of an economy. That's what we're talking about. The economy is able to produce more this year than it was last year. That's economic growth. What's sustainable? Well, we don't put a number on it, but probably roughly 2.5% increase in GDP each year. GDP, for those who don't remember, is gross domestic product. It's the total value of everything made in an economy over a year. So about 2.5% each year, we reckon that's what we can increase by year on year, increasing our capacity. But there are two ways of looking at growth. We can have short-run growth, and in the short run, that's just making more. Demand going up, so we make more goods. And we can show it on a short-run ASAD diagram. So we've got real national output along the bottom there, and we've got price level along the vertical axis. And we start at an initial equilibrium, so aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and that gives us an output somewhere around there and a nice stable price level. Something happens to cause that demand to go up. Maybe we've lowered interest rates, maybe consumers got more income, something along those lines, and demand increases. Well, now we're at AD2, and two things have happened. The first thing is we have had more output. Squeeze Y2 in there. Output has gone up. We're making more than we were before. So in one sense, that has been growth. But along with that, price level has risen as well. We've had inflation too. This sort of short-run growth then is caused by anything that increases aggregate demand. AD, you'll remember, is consumer spending or consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending, then plus our balance of trade, so exports minus imports. So anything that increases consumer spending, perhaps an increase in income, anything that increases investment spending, maybe a decrease in interest rates, so firms can borrow more money more cheaply, or just the government increasing their spending, all of those things are going to lead to an increase in aggregate demand. It's quick, it's easy, but it comes at the cost of inflation, and we can't just keep it going and going. The other kind of economic growth we're interested in is long-run economic growth. So instead of just increasing demand, we actually have to increase our ability to make goods and services. Think about your school. If your school wants to grow, then it could do it by squeezing more desks into each classroom. And we could add another desk and another student and keep squeezing them in. But eventually, you're going to run out of space. That's like increasing demand bit by bit, but we can't just increase the amount we make from the resources we've got. We've got to increase our capacity to make things. So the same as perhaps building a new classroom block at school, now you're able to have more students than you could before. We can show that on an ASAD diagram as well, but we're going to need a long-run ASAD diagram. So the same axes as before. I've got real national output on the bottom and price level up the side, but now I'm going to need a long-run aggregate supply curve. That's a Keynesian long-run aggregate supply curve. If you're not familiar with those, have a look on the website and you'll find some things that help you with them. But instead of just increasing demand like we were before, now we're going to have to increase our capacity to make things. So there's my starting point. I've got a particular level of output, Y1 there. And I've got a particular price level, PL1. When I increase the productive capacity of the economy, I draw a new aggregate supply curve. So I now have long-run AS2, and look what's happened to output. Output's increased to Y2, but this time, price level's fallen. Now, in reality, we probably wouldn't have deflation. We'd just have prices rising less quickly than they were before. But look at the difference between the two. Short-run economic growth, I get increased output, but only with inflation. Long-run economic growth, I get increased output, and the price level falls. The way we get that long-run economic growth is by increasing the quality or quantity of our factors of production. Hopefully you remember that we have 4 factors of production. There's land, labour, capital, and finally enterprise. Land, so not just physical ground, but also stuff that we dig out of the ground, stuff we fish from it, stuff we grow from it. Labour, that's the physical and mental effort people put into making things. Capital, that's capital equipment, machinery, production lines, things like that. And enterprise, that's the skill of putting it all together and creating that kind of business. So we could get more land by perhaps finding new resources, finding more oil in the North Sea, something along those lines. We could get more labour through immigration, more capital through investing more, buying more capital equipment, and more enterprise by having advice for business startups and training people in how to set up their own businesses. That's more of land, labour, capital and enterprise. Or we could get better land, labour, capital and enterprise. It's a little bit hard to improve land, although there are some ways. Labour is things like education and training. So better schooling, more university places to improve labour. Capital is research and development. So developing new computers, new production techniques that mean I can make more. Not just buying more computers, but getting better computers. And enterprise, again, is about education and training. So you can see economic growth is not quite as straightforward as it looks. We have 2.5% increase in GDP. That's roughly what we think is sustainable. But there are still 2 ways of growing. In the short run, we can grow through an increase in AD. In the long run, we can grow through an increase in productive capacity. And actually, we're going to need both of those. There's no point in just increasing our productive capacity more and more and more if we're not using it by growing demand. Just as there's no point in building more and more classrooms at your school if there aren't more and more students coming in to the school to take up those places. But we can't just increase demand by having more students wanting to come in if we don't keep building the classroom space as well. In the long run, we need both.